It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. My neighbor Tom and I decided to camp in the woods behind our houses. We set up our tents a few hundred feet apart, hoping to get away from the everyday grind. As night came, I built a fire and sat by it, enjoying the usual forest sounds. I noticed Tom's tent was unusually quiet. It struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it. Around midnight, the forest went eerily quiet. The usual chirping of crickets and rustling leaves stopped, replaced by a strange silence. I heard soft rustling noises coming from Tom's tent. It sounded like someone or something was moving around inside. I figured it was just the night and tried to relax. Then I saw a flashlight beam flickering in the distance from Tom's direction. I thought he might be searching for something. I picked up my flashlight and went over to check if he needed help. As I got closer, I called out softly, but no one answered. The flashlight beam was moving in an odd way. When I reached Tom's tent, I saw it was unzipped and the flashlight was on the ground, still shining. The tent was empty. My heart started pounding. I looked around, feeling more and more uneasy. The forest was unnervingly quiet again. I heard footsteps behind me, quick, deliberate steps. I turned around, but there was no one there. My gut told me to get back to my tent and call for help. I rushed back, trying to stay calm. I grabbed my phone but realized there was no signal. I kept my flashlight on and looked around nervously. Hours passed and the silence fell heavily. Just before dawn, I heard a voice. It wasn't Tom's. It was someone calling for help from the woods. The voice was weak and desperate. I followed the sound, pushing through the thick brush. Eventually, I found Tom. He was disoriented and hurt badly. He had been attacked and knocked out cold. Tom later said he heard someone approaching his tent, so he grabbed the flashlight to check it out. When he stepped outside, someone hit him from behind. He never saw who it was, but his injuries showed the attacker had left him for dead. The police came and searched the area. They didn't find the attacker, but they said it was likely someone local with a bad record. We were lucky to have survived. The worst part was when Tom mentioned seeing dark figures moving around his tent before he was attacked. It felt like the woods themselves had turned against us. We never found out who did this or why. The woods were no longer a safe place, but a chilling reminder that danger could be lurking in the darkest corners. I still get shivers thinking about it and avoid those woods whenever I can. I went camping with my grandmother deep in the woods. She loved being outside and somehow talked me into coming along for the weekend. I wasn't really excited about it, but she always looked so calm out there, so I agreed. We set up our tent near a small stream with tall trees all around us. The first day was pretty quiet. We walked a bit, cooked dinner over a small fire, and watched the stars before heading into the tent to sleep. That night, something felt weird. I couldn't explain it, but the woods were too quiet. No wind, no bugs, just still. I lay there for a while, staring at the roof of the tent, feeling uneasy. I told myself it was just because we were so far from anything, and I tried to sleep. The next day, we spent most of it walking around, but that strange feeling stayed with me. Every time I looked at the trees, I got this sense that something was watching us. My grandmother didn't seem to notice anything strange, so I didn't mention it. By the time the sun started going down, I was more than ready to go to sleep and just get through the night. While we sat by the fire that evening, I kept hearing odd noises from the woods. It wasn't animals, at least not any I could recognize. The sounds were low, like something big was moving through the bushes, but it never got close enough to see. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, but I didn't want to worry my grandmother, so I stayed quiet. After we put out the fire, we went back to the tent. It was even quieter than the night before. I lay there for what felt like forever, that uneasy feeling growing stronger. My grandmother was sound asleep next to me, totally unaware of how tense I was. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They weren't far from the tent, maybe 20 feet or so, and they were slow and steady. I froze. not moving a muscle, listening closely. The steps circled the tent, not too close, but never too far. This wasn't just some animal wandering by. Whoever or whatever it was, they were taking their time. I stayed completely still, hardly breathing. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I hoped they had left, but then they started again, this time even closer. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought whoever was out there could probably hear it. I had no idea what to do. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the woods, but I knew it wasn't over. I couldn't sleep after that. I lay awake, listening to every little sound outside the tent. The night dragged on forever, but when the sun finally came up, I was relieved, tired, but relieved. That morning, we packed up to leave. I didn't tell my grandmother about the noises, but I couldn't wait to get out of there. As we hiked back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like something or someone was watching us. The woods were too quiet again, and it made me feel like we weren't alone. Just before we got to the car, I noticed something by the tree line. There were footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were big human footprints, fresh, and they had been right next to our tent. I stared at the prints, my stomach turning. Someone had been out there, walking around us while we slept, watching us. I looked back at the woods, but I couldn't see anyone. Still, I knew somehow they were still out there, watching, waiting. Maybe they had followed us the whole time, hiding just out of sight. I realized then that no matter how far we drove, no matter how far we tried to get away, we had been seen, marked, and maybe one day they'd come back. I needed a break. Being a cop can take a toll on you, so I figured camping alone for a weekend would help me clear my mind. I found a quiet spot deep in the woods, far away from the noise of cars and the constant rush of people. It felt like the perfect escape. The first night was calm. All I could hear were the sounds of the forest, leaves blowing in the wind, birds singing, and every now and then a branch snapping in the distance. It was peaceful. The quiet and fresh air were just what I needed. But on the second night, things felt different. Wrong, even. I set up my tent and got a fire going, but something was off. The forest wasn't as lively as it had been. There were no animal sounds, no breeze, just this strange, heavy silence. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe I was just overthinking things because of the job. It's hard to fully relax after years of being a cop. You're always alert, always watching. But this silence, it was too much. Felt unnatural. At some point, I started hearing footsteps. They were slow, like whoever or whatever it was trying not to be noticed. They were far away, but not too far. I couldn't tell if it was real or if I was just getting jumpy, but it was enough to make me uneasy. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area around my campsite, shining the light into the trees. Nothing. No movement. No sign of anyone. I went back to sitting by the fire, staring into the dark woods. I kept waiting for the sound to come back, but all I could hear was the crackling of the fire. It stayed quiet, and I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer, something harmless. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Hours passed, and I decided to get some sleep. I crawled into my tent, trying to calm myself down. But then I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were much closer. My heart started racing. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. I felt this tightness in my chest as I pointed the light toward the trees again. Nothing, just darkness. But then, as I turned to go back to my tent, I saw them, footprints, fresh ones, circling my campsite. My blood ran cold. These weren't mine. Someone had been here, walking around me while I sat by the fire, watching me. That realization hit me hard. Someone had been out there, maybe still was, watching the whole time. My heart was pounding. I backed into my tent, grabbed my bag and flashlight, and started packing as fast as I could. I wanted out of there. But then I heard it again, those footsteps. And now they weren't just coming from one direction. I could hear them all around me. I froze for a second, listening, trying to figure out how close they were. Whoever was out there, they were close, and there wasn't just one of them. I could feel the eyes on me from the dark, just outside the reach of the firelight. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed my stuff and started heading down the trail. My flashlight shook in my hand. I could hear them following me, not too close, but close enough to make sure I knew they were there. I walked faster, then started running. The footsteps kept up with me, staying just out of sight. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I threw my gear in, jumped in the driver's seat, and sped down the dirt road. Before I pulled away, I looked back one last time. Standing at the edge of the trees, just where the light from my car reached, were a few dark shapes, people watching me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I sat in the car for a while, catching my breath. I thought about reporting it, but I knew better. No one would find anything. I've seen enough in my years on the force to know that sometimes the worst things aren't supernatural or from some fairy tale. Sometimes it's just people. And what's scary is those people out there, they knew the woods better than me. They weren't just watching me for fun. They were waiting. They wanted me to know I wasn't alone out there. And what's worse is, I got away. But I have no idea how many others didn't. I was camping alone, deep in the woods, far from anyone. I had been doing this for years, and I always liked the quiet at night. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. It usually made me feel calm, but this time something felt different. I couldn't tell why, but it just felt wrong. It started just before sunset. I was setting up my tent when I noticed how quiet the woods were. Too quiet. No crickets, no birds, nothing. At first, I shrugged it off, but as the night went on, the silence started to bother me. I built a fire and sat by it, eating my dinner. That's when I began to feel it, a strange feeling, like someone was watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but no one was there. It was just darkness outside the reach of the fire's light. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling. The longer I sat there, the worse it got. I told myself it was all in my head. I was out here alone, far from anyone. There was no reason to feel uneasy, but I couldn't stop the growing fear that was creeping in. Eventually, I decided to go to bed. I figured I'd feel better after some sleep. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down, trying to relax. But every little noise outside sounded louder now. Every twig snapping or leaf crunching made my heart race. I kept telling myself it was just animals, but it didn't feel like animals. The sounds were too slow, too careful. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the roof of my tent, listening to the night. Then I heard it, footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, just outside my tent. They stopped right next to me. I froze, holding my breath, too scared to move. There was nothing but silence. The footsteps stopped, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I waited, barely breathing, for something to happen, but nothing did. After what felt like hours, the footsteps started again, moving away slowly, fading into the trees. I stayed still for a long time, listening, but the footsteps didn't come back. I finally worked up the nerve to grab my flashlight and unzip the tent. I shined the light into the trees, looking for any sign of what or who had been out there. But there was nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no proof that anyone had been there at all. But I knew what I heard. My heart was still racing, and I knew I had to get out of there. I packed up everything as fast as I could, barely taking time to think. I threw my stuff in the car and sped off, not looking back. I never figured out what or who it was that night, but sometimes when I'm alone in a quiet place, I still hear those footsteps in my mind, slow and heavy. It makes me wonder if whatever it was didn't really leave that night. Maybe it's still out there, waiting in the dark for me to come back. About 5 years ago, my sister, a friend of mine, my girlfriend, and I decided to take a trip to Sierra County, California, deep in the mountains near a small town called Downeyville. We were heading to a brewfest in town and chose to camp rather than book a hotel. We took a road called Kala, also known as Forest Road 25, which eventually becomes Forest Road 55. Looking for an off-grid camping spot, we drove about 7 miles up this road from the main road leading to Downeyville, which was at least 5 or 6 miles before reaching the town. There wasn't much out there, except for a few campsites right off the main road. We hadn't gone much farther when we found a clearing among the trees and decided to set up camp. As we were finishing setting up around sunset, an older woman suddenly appeared, walking into our camp from the woods. She was dressed in what looked like hippie-style clothing, probably around 60 years old, frail and small, with brownish-gray hair. My first thought was how strange it was, because there were no cars or other signs of people anywhere on this road. I asked her what she was doing up there, and she said she was camping just on the other side of the creek with her husband. Then she asked if we had any water, which seemed odd, given how far we were from civilization. We gave her some water, and she then asked for a cigarette. I asked if she had come from Downeyville, but she said no, she was from Culvert, pointing further up the mountain, saying they had been walking for a long time. I offered her the rest of my cigarettes, telling her I would buy more in Downeyville. She seemed oddly moved by this gesture. She pulled a silver cross necklace from her collar and insisted I take it. Not being religious, I refused, but she kept insisting, more seriously each time. My girlfriend, sister, and friend were watching this, clearly creeped out. There was something strange about her, like she wasn't from modern times. Even when I handed her the water bottle, it seemed foreign to her. Eventually, we told her we had to leave, and she wandered back into the woods. On our way out, we looked for any sign of another camp or car in the direction she pointed to, but found nothing. We returned to camp around 11:30 or midnight, had a campfire, and then went to bed around 1 a.m. At around 3 a.m., my sister, who was in a tent down the hill near the creek, said she heard something walking around on the other side of the creek. We talked back and forth for about 20 minutes. I couldn't hear much, but she was getting more and more scared, so I told her to come sleep in my tent with my girlfriend, and I would sleep in hers. I had a .45 pistol and didn't think much of it. We traded spots, and I went back to sleep in her tent. About 20 minutes later, I heard something walking around near us, very distinctly pacing back and forth in the woods. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal, but it definitely wasn't a small animal. This went on for about an hour, with me falling asleep and then being woken up again. I was getting unnerved and a bit annoyed since I was trying to sleep off some beer. It kept going until I heard whatever it was start crossing the creek and coming up the embankment toward my tent. It walked right past my tent and toward our fire and my truck, which was backed up to the fire. I heard something rustling around our camp, and then I heard something banging on metal. I realized whatever it was trying to break into my Bronco. My first thought was that it was a bear smelling food in the truck. Now I was really freaked out. With no other option, I slowly and quietly unzipped my tent, carefully poked my head out with my gun, and looked toward my truck in the fire. To my surprise, it was a full-grown buck, horns and all, standing there, staring at the embers of our fire like it was trying to warm up. I was relieved, but decided to scare it off. I hit the wall of the tent, half out of the doorway, and yelled, "Get out of here!" To my shock, the deer just turned its head, looked at me, and then back at the fire. It didn't move. I tried again, louder and more animated this time. It slowly turned and started walking towards me, which was extremely unnerving. Deer are usually scared of people and don't approach them. At this point, I was really freaked out. It was a big buck. I quickly got back in the tent, zipped it up, and just waited. The buck walked up to the tent, and I could see its silhouette from the firelight on the tent wall. It stood there next to the entrance to my tent for a good minute or two, then continued snooping around our campsite. Eventually, it wandered off in the same direction the woman had gone. Throughout the night, I kept hearing something different, a deer moving around near the creek on the other side. I hardly got any sleep, but around 5 a.m., I must have dozed off because I was suddenly woken up by the sound of the woman on the other side of the creek calling out, "Hauling O? Hello, hello, can you hear me? Can I have some water? I'm really thirsty." I ignored her because I was so damn tired and because it was so creepy. She stopped, then came back about 15 minutes later, calling out again. She did this a few times, and it just weirded me out. It was just starting to get light in the sky, the really early morning. We all got up, packed up, and began the 2.5-hour drive home. On the way out, I pulled off on a dirt path to see if I could spot her camp down an embankment. I found an old fire ring, cold as the earth, clearly not used in a while. But there were signs someone had been there recently, like Camel cigarette butts, the same brand I smoke. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold, a whole head of brownish gray hair, like a wig that had fallen apart, just lying in the dirt where it looked like someone had been lying. It looked exactly like the woman's hair. I got back in my truck and got out of there fast. The next morning, after getting home, I went out to my truck and noticed my license plate was gone, like it had been torn off. If it had been missing at the campsite, we would have noticed. I can't help but think that whatever that deer or whatever it was that had been messing with my tailgate took it. Just weird, creepy stuff, man. I came across the cabin while hiking through thick woods. It was an old, rundown building, barely visible through the dense trees. The place looked abandoned, like it had been forgotten for years. The wooden walls were faded and gray. The roof was weighed down with moss, and the windows were covered in dirt. Something about it made me want to check it out, even though a small part of me felt uneasy about it. I decided to go inside, thinking it might be a good place to take a break. As I got closer, the air around the cabin seemed different, heavier. The front door made a loud creaking noise as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the quiet woods. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled musty, like old wood and rot. There was a wooden table in the middle of the room with a few broken chairs around it. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, untouched for who knows how long. I stepped inside, leaving clear footprints in the dust. As I moved deeper into the cabin, I noticed that the walls were lined with shelves filled with jars. They were covered in dust like everything else, and it was hard to see what was inside them in the dim light. I wiped the dust off one of the jars and saw that it was filled with something that looked like dried plants. Another jar held what looked like small animal bones, brittle and fragile. Suddenly, I heard a creak from the floorboards. I froze. It didn't come from where I was standing. My heart started to race as I turned around to look behind me, but there was nothing there. The cabin was empty, just like when I walked in. I told myself it was probably just the old wood shifting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Trying to ignore the uneasiness crawling up my back, I kept exploring the cabin. There was a narrow staircase leading to an upper floor. The steps groaned under my weight as I climbed up, the wood feeling weak and ready to give out. The upper floor was just as dusty and abandoned as the rest of the cabin, with an old bed pushed up against one wall and a large wooden chest in the corner. The chest caught my attention. It was big, made of dark wood, and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I walked over to it, curiosity getting the better of me. The lid was heavy, and I had to pull hard to open it. Inside, I found a pile of old moth-eaten clothes, some yellowed papers, and a small metal box. The box was locked, but the lock was rusty and weak. I managed to break it open with a few tugs. Inside the box were old photos, black and white, the edges worn and curling. The photos showed people, families, couples, children, posing in front of the same cabin I was standing in. The clothes they wore were old-fashioned from a long time ago. As I flipped through the photos, I noticed something strange. The same man was in almost all of them, standing in the background, his face partly hidden or blurry. He was always there, watching but never clear. A cold shiver ran through me as I realized that the man wasn't part of the families in the photos. He was just there, like a shadow. My breath caught in my throat as I looked at the last photo in the stack. It was a picture of the cabin taken from the outside, and there, standing at the window, was the man, staring out with eyes that seemed too dark, too empty. I slammed the box shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of there. Something was wrong with this place, something dark. I rushed down the stairs, almost tripping in my hurry. As I reached the bottom, I noticed that the front door, which I had left open, was now closed. The unease in my gut turned into full-blown fear. I yanked the door open and bolted out of the cabin, not looking back. As I ran through the woods, I felt something behind me, something cold and unrelenting. I didn't stop running until I was far away from the cabin, my lungs burning and my legs shaking. When I finally dared to look back, the cabin was hidden by the trees, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I couldn't stop thinking about those old photos, about the man who was always there, lurking in the background. I never went back to that part of the woods again, but the memory of that cabin and the man in the photos still haunts me even now. Every so often, I feel like I'm being watched, even when I'm sure I'm alone. Sometimes when I'm in the dark, I catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, just a shadow, but it's enough to make my heart race. I know it's probably nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me, but I can't shake the feeling that the man from the photos is still out there, watching, waiting. And I'm terrified that one day I'll turn around and see him standing there in the background, just like in those old photos. And this time, he won't be blurry. He'll be real. And he'll be right there, watching me with those empty, dark eyes. I didn't expect my weekend to turn out like this. My neighbor Sam invited me to his cabin for a few days. We weren't close friends, but we got along fine, and I thought it would be a nice break. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any main roads. Cell service barely worked, and the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of animals. The first day was normal. We fished at a nearby lake and chopped wood for the fireplace. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. That night, as we sat around the fire inside, I started to feel uneasy. The darkness outside felt oppressive, like the trees were closing in on us, as if the forest was alive and watching. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just the isolation getting to me, but as the night went on, the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. I barely slept, waking up at every creak and groan of the old cabin. The next morning, Sam suggested a hike deeper into the woods. I wasn't thrilled, but I didn't want to seem scared of a few trees. We set out, following a trail that twisted through the dense forest. The trees were so thick in some places that it felt like twilight, even though it was the middle of the day. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone following us, but there was nothing. We reached a small clearing after about 2 hours. Sam wanted to keep going, but I was done. My nerves were shot, and all I wanted was to get back to the cabin. We turned around, retracing our steps. That's when I noticed something strange. The trail looked different. Trees that should have been familiar felt out of place, and some turns seemed sharper than I remembered. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just tired. Then we reached a fork in the trail that we hadn't passed before. There were no signs, no markers, just two paths going in opposite directions. Sam didn't seem worried. He shrugged and picked one, saying it didn't matter which way we went, since both should lead back to the cabin. But deep down, I knew we were lost. The sun was sinking, and the woods were getting darker. The sounds around us changed too. What had been the peaceful hum of nature now felt eerie, like something was moving in the shadows, just out of sight. I tried to stay calm, to focus on finding our way back, but with every step, my anxiety grew. Finally, after what felt like hours, we stumbled upon the cabin again. I felt relief as I saw the familiar shape through the trees, but that relief was short-lived. As we got closer, I realized something was wrong. The cabin looked different, older, more worn down. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar. We had locked up before leaving. Sam pushed the door open. The inside was cold, much colder than it should have been with the fire we had left burning. Everything was in disarray. The furniture was overturned, and there were deep scratches on the walls, as if something had clawed at them. A heavy silence filled the cabin, broken only by the faint creaking of the floorboards. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was in the cabin with us. Something that had been waiting. Without saying anything, Sam and I grabbed our things and headed for the door. But as we stepped outside, the reality of our situation hit me. The woods were dark, the trail impossible to see. Even if we could find our way back to the car, we were miles from the nearest town. We were trapped, alone in the middle of nowhere. We spent the rest of the night in silence, too afraid to sleep or move. The minutes dragged on, the air thick with fear. I kept my eyes on the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment. But nothing happened. Nothing ever happened. When the first light of dawn came through the windows, I made up my mind. We had to leave, immediately. We packed up what little we had and left the cabin without looking back. As we reached the car and drove away, the tension started to ease, but it never fully went away. Something had changed in those woods, in that cabin. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never go back, and I'll never talk to Sam about it. Some things are better left forgotten, but I know I won't forget. I'll always remember that feeling, the certainty that something was out there, watching, waiting, and I'll always wonder if it's still there, in those woods, waiting for the next person to wander too far from the safety of the trail. The worst part? Sometimes, late at night, I can't help but think that whatever was waiting for us didn't just stay in that cabin. It might have followed us back. I had been counting down the days to my weekend at the cabin. Work had been wearing me down, and the idea of getting away from everything for a few days in a quiet, far-off place sounded like exactly what I needed. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine who hardly ever used it. When he offered it to me, I didn't hesitate to take him up on it. The cabin was deep in the woods, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. The road that led to it was narrow and twisted, with trees pressing in on both sides. By the time I finally arrived, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin itself was small but warm, with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, and just one bedroom. It was simple, but it was perfect for what I needed. The first night was quiet. I made a quick dinner, read a little by the fire, and went to bed early. The stillness of the woods felt calming, and I fell asleep easily. The next day, I spent most of my time outside, checking out the area around the cabin. The woods were thick with lots of undergrowth that made it easy to get turned around. I made sure to keep the cabin in sight as I walked, not wanting to get lost. As the day went on, though, I started to feel uneasy, like someone was watching me. Every now and then I thought I heard something moving in the trees, but whenever I looked, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me because I was alone in a strange place. That night, the uneasy feeling didn't go away. I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. The woods, which had felt so peaceful the night before, now seemed to be hiding something. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling just kept getting stronger as the hours passed. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The cabin was completely dark, and every creak of the wood or rustle of the wind outside made me jump. At some point in the night, I heard a noise that made my heart skip a beat. It was soft at first, a faint scratching sound coming from the kitchen. I froze, listening closely. The scratching kept going, getting louder, more insistent. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. It had to be an animal, I told myself, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel that had gotten inside somehow. But the more I listened, the less I believed that. The scratching sounded too deliberate, like someone was trying to get in. I slowly got out of bed and crept toward the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching stopped as soon as I walked into the room. I stood there in the dark, listening, waiting for something to happen, but there was nothing, just silence. I checked the doors and windows, making sure they were all locked. They were. I even looked outside, shining a flashlight into the darkness, but I didn't see anything unusual. Eventually, I convinced myself that it had to be some kind of animal and went back to bed. But I couldn't sleep. Every little sound put me on edge, and I spent the rest of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling. The next morning, I felt drained and jittery. The scratching sound from the night before was still stuck in my head, but there was no sign of anything strange in the cabin. I decided to cut my trip short and leave that day. I packed up quickly and loaded everything into the car. As I was about to leave, I took one last look around the cabin. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the outside of the front door, just below the window, there were deep scratches in the wood. They were fresh. The wood beneath the paint was raw and exposed. The marks were too big to have been made by any small animal. It looked like someone had been trying to claw their way inside. A cold shiver ran through me as I realized how close I had been to something dangerous. I hurried into my car and drove away as fast as I could, leaving the cabin and whatever had been out there far behind. As I drove away, I could stop thinking about how close I had been to whatever was out there. The scratches on the door were proof that something had been there, something I couldn't see or hear. It had been close enough to touch the cabin, close enough to almost get inside while I was sleeping, completely unaware of how much danger I was in. That was the last time I ever went to that cabin. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about those scratches and wonder what would have happened if whatever was out there had made it inside. Would I even be here to tell the story? I'll never know, and that's what haunts me the most. Something was out there in those woods, something real, and it almost got me. I never thought I'd run into him again, especially not here. The cabin had always been my safe spot, a place where I could get away from everything. After the divorce, I found myself coming here more often. It was far out, quiet, surrounded by thick trees, the perfect place to escape. That day, I got there late in the afternoon. The sun was setting behind the trees, and long shadows stretched across the small yard in front of the cabin. I unpacked the car, brought my bags inside, and started a fire in the fireplace. The warmth and crackling of the fire helped me relax. It felt good to be away from everything. I made some coffee and settled into the old chair by the window, looking out at the woods as they got darker. But something didn't feel right. The usual peace I felt here was replaced by a feeling of unease that I couldn't shake. I tried to ignore it, blaming it on stress. Then I heard it, a twig snapping outside. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal. But as the night went on, the sounds kept happening, footsteps crunching in the leaves, moving around the cabin. They weren't heavy, but they weren't light enough to be just an animal either. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air hit me as I looked around the tree line. Nothing moved. I stood there for a while, listening. The woods were too quiet, unnaturally quiet. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to calm down. Hours passed, but I couldn't sleep. The uneasy feeling kept growing stronger. Every little noise made my heart race. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Finally, I decided to try and sleep, hoping I'd feel better in the morning. I got into bed, keeping the flashlight close. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it again, the clear sound of footsteps on the porch. My heart pounded in my chest. Whoever it was, they were right outside the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened, hoping they'd go away. But the footsteps didn't leave. Instead, they moved along the side of the cabin, stopping right outside the bedroom window. I stared at the window, half expecting to see a face staring back at me, but there was nothing. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. The footsteps finally moved away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there in the dark, listening for any sign of movement. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted but too scared to leave the cabin. I stayed inside, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. As the day went on, I started to relax a bit. The daylight made everything seem less scary. I even managed to step outside for a moment, just to get some fresh air. I walked around the cabin, looking for any sign of who or what had been there the night before. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints circling the cabin. They were fresh. Too fresh. My heart sank. I quickly packed my things, throwing everything into the car as fast as I could. I didn't care about the cabin anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. As I was about to leave, I noticed something in the dirt near the cabin door, a small folded piece of paper weighed down by a rock. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I unfolded it. It was a note written in his handwriting. 3 words. I'm watching you. I dropped the note and backed away, my heart pounding. I jumped into the car and drove away as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I never returned to that cabin. I never told anyone what happened, but the fear never left me. Even when I'm alone in my own home, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him standing there watching. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, sure that I heard those same footsteps outside my window. And I know, no matter how far I run, that he'll always be out there somewhere, waiting. I was always close to my sister-in-law, Sarah. We got along great, and our families spent a lot of weekends together. So when she suggested a weekend camping trip, I thought it was a good idea. We figured it would be a good way to get away from work stress and the noise of the city. I had been camping before, but this time felt different. I couldn't shake a weird feeling that something was wrong. We picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any town. The drive up was nice, with the trees growing thicker as we went deeper into the forest. The campsite was beautiful, right by a small clear lake. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and settled in for what we thought would be a relaxing night. The first night was calm. We cooked over the fire, told stories, and laughed until we were too tired to stay awake. But the next day, I started noticing things that didn't seem right. First, it was small stuff. The sounds of the forest seemed too quiet, like the usual rustling of leaves and animal noises had stopped. Then, as we sat by the lake, I noticed footprints along the shore that weren't ours. They were fresh, leading out of the water and disappearing into the trees. I didn't say anything to Sarah because I didn't want to freak her out, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. They were big, too big to be a normal person. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. Later that night, as we sat by the fire again, I heard something in the distance, a low, deep sound like a growl. It was faint, but it made me freeze. Sarah didn't seem to hear it, or if she did, she didn't react. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear far off in the woods. But the feeling that something was wrong only got stronger. When we finally went to bed, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside made me jump. The wind through the trees, the crack of a branch, the rustling of leaves. It all seemed louder, closer. I lay in my tent, staring up at the darkness, listening, waiting for something, anything. Then I heard it again, the growl, closer this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. I sat up, my heart racing. The footsteps were coming from just outside the tent. They were slow, careful, like whatever was out there didn't want to be heard. I held my breath, trying to listen. The footsteps circled the tent, then stopped right at the entrance. I could hear heavy breathing, deep and rough, like something big was just inches away. I wanted to scream to wake Sarah, but I was too scared to move. The breathing went on for what felt like forever. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps slowly moved away, fading into the night. I didn't dare move until the first light of morning. When the sun finally came up, I rushed out of the tent. The ground outside was messed up with large prints pressed deep into the dirt, leading from the tent back into the woods. I woke Sarah, and we packed up as fast as we could, neither of us saying a word to each other. We left the campsite as quickly as possible, neither of us looking back. On the drive home, the silence between us was heavy. We both knew something had been out there, something watching us. We never spoke about what happened that night, but we never went camping again. The fear of whatever was in those woods, of what we might have run into, was enough to keep us far away from the wilderness. To this day, I still think about those footsteps, that breathing, and wonder what was out there. What if we hadn't left when we did? What if it had decided to come into the tent? I'll never know, but I don't need to. The thought of what could have happened is enough to keep me from ever going back. But the thing that still haunts me, the thing I can't forget, is that those footprints didn't just come from the woods. They led back into the lake. Whatever was out there came from the water. Now, every time I see a quiet lake, I wonder what might be lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for its next chance to come ashore. I've always liked the peace of camping. Being out in the wild by myself makes me feel free. This time, I planned to camp for a few days alone, so I found a quiet spot near a small lake deep in the woods. The only sign of other people was a tent set up a few hundred yards away. A man I had met earlier who called himself my neighbor in the wild. He seemed friendly, a bit older, wearing faded camouflage clothes. He mentioned that he used to be in the military, a retired commander. The first day went by without any trouble. I spent the morning setting up my camp, gathering firewood, and getting ready for a quiet evening under the stars. As the sun started to set, I noticed my neighbor standing by the water, staring out at nothing. There was something odd about the way he stood, stiff, almost like he was waiting for something. The next morning, I woke up to find him gone. His tent was still there, but he was nowhere to be seen. At first, I didn't worry. People often head out early to hike or fish. But as the day went on and he didn't come back, I started to feel uneasy. The air felt heavy, and the forest was unusually quiet. I tried to focus on my own tasks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By the time night came, he still hadn't returned. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it didn't feel right to just leave without knowing what had happened. So I decided to walk over to his campsite and check things out. His tent was shut, everything neatly packed away, like he hadn't planned to be gone for long. I walked around his campsite, calling out, but there was only silence. That's when I noticed something strange, a small patch of disturbed dirt not far from his tent. It looked like someone had been digging there recently, but the dirt had been hastily covered up. My heart started to race, and I felt panic rising, but I tried to stay calm. I found a stick and started to dig. As I cleared away the dirt, I uncovered a shallow pit. Inside were a few items, a knife, a worn dog tag, and a notebook. The dog tag had a name on it I didn't recognize, but it was the notebook that caught my attention. I flipped through it and saw page after page filled with notes about survival skills, old military missions, and strangely, entries about this very camping trip. The last entry made my blood run cold. It described how he'd been following a man who matched my description. It talked about how he was planning to eliminate the target because the mission wasn't finished. There was no name, but the description was too close to mine. His paranoia, his obsession with this mission had made him believe I was some kind of enemy. I froze. The forest suddenly felt too quiet, too close. That's when I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I was alone in the clearing, but I could feel eyes on me. My mind raced. He was out there somewhere, watching me, waiting for the right moment. He might have been ex-military, but something had clearly snapped in his mind, and he decided I was the enemy. I didn't stick around to find out what he planned to do. I dropped the notebook and ran back to my camp. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting him to show up at any moment, but he never did. The only sounds were my racing heartbeat and the rustling leaves in the wind. I left the forest that night, driving nonstop until I was miles away. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, his twisted sense of duty pushing him to complete a mission that never existed. As I lie awake at night, I can still picture him standing by the lake, waiting. I can't help but wonder if he's found a new target or if one day he'll track me down again. I know I should forget about it, but there's something in the way he looked at me, something that tells me this isn't over. Maybe it's just paranoia, or maybe it's the truth, that he's still out there searching and that I'll never truly be safe. My ex-wife and I had been divorced for almost a year, but we still needed to settle things with the cabin we had bought together a few years back. Deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, it was meant to be our escape from the world, a place to reconnect. But things didn't work out, and now we had to meet one last time to figure out what to do with it. I arrived first. The drive seemed longer than usual, probably because I hadn't been there since the split. The cabin looked the same, but it felt different, like it was holding on to memories that had turned sour. I unlocked the door and went inside. The air was musty, and dust had covered everything. I lit a fire in the old stone fireplace to warm up the place, then sat on the worn-out couch, waiting. Late in the afternoon, she finally showed up. I saw her car through the window. She stepped out, looking just as I remembered, maybe a little more tired, a little more worn out. She didn't come in right away. I could see her outside staring at the cabin, maybe thinking about what we had lost. When she finally came inside, there was no need for words. We both knew why we were there. I showed her around, pointing out things that needed fixing. She nodded, but I could tell she was just as eager to leave as I was. The place held too many old memories. After we made our decisions, we went our separate ways in the cabin, checking on different things. I went to the back, where the woods met the edge of the property. The trees were thick, and the shadows had started to stretch out, making everything look darker. I felt uneasy standing there, like something was watching me from the trees. I shook off the feeling and went back inside. She was in the kitchen, looking through the cupboards. I went to the bedroom, the one we used to share. The bed was still there, covered in an old quilt. I sat on the edge, staring out the window at the woods. The same uneasy feeling came back, stronger this time. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the cabin felt different, like it had changed since we were last there. I stood up and walked out of the room, heading back to the living room. She was there, sitting on the couch, staring into the fire. I sat down across from her, trying to ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. The fire crackled, and the shadows danced on the walls. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. I felt like I needed to get out of there, but I didn't want to leave her alone. As the sun started to set, I suggested we leave. She agreed. We gathered our things and stepped outside. The air was colder now, and the woods were darker. As we walked to our cars, I glanced back at the cabin. It looked empty, like it was waiting for something or someone. We didn't say goodbye. We just got into our cars and drove off. I didn't look back again. The road out of the woods was long and winding, but I was glad to be on it. I kept driving, the cabin fading from my mind with each mile. A few days later, I got a call from her. She was staying at her sister's place, far from the cabin, but she said she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She felt like she was being watched, like something had followed her from the cabin. I didn't know what to say. I had felt the same thing, but I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to believe that the cabin had any hold on us. But as the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling either. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cabin, dark and empty, waiting in the woods. That's when I realized it wasn't the cabin that had changed. It was us. The cabin was just a place made of wood and stone, but we had left something behind, something we couldn't get rid of, no matter how far we drove. The cabin had become a part of us, a part we couldn't escape. It was always there, waiting, watching, and no matter where we went, it followed. The cabin was just a building. But what we left behind had become something else, something we couldn't run from. I began to notice that wherever I went, I felt that same eerie presence. Every place I stayed, every new location seemed to carry a hint of that same unsettling feeling. I would wake up in the middle of the night to hear faint creaks and see shadows moving just beyond my vision. The silence was never truly quiet, always filled with a subtle, almost imperceptible sound of something or someone lurking just out of sight. One night, while lying in bed, I felt a cold breath on my neck and heard a whisper that I couldn't quite make out. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked around the room, but nothing was there. Yet the feeling of being watched never left. I realized then that the cabin had followed me, not as a place, but as a presence, a lingering shadow that had become part of my life. Now, every time I move or change my surroundings, I keep expecting that feeling to go away, but it doesn't. I have come to understand that no matter where I go, that part of me, that piece of the cabin's dark past, will always be with me, waiting, watching. And that thought is what keeps me up at night, knowing that I'll never truly escape the shadows we left behind. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks, and tons of fantastic camping spots. Unfortunately, my hometown is relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, many of the people where I live are struggling financially. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I can do most of my work online. If I didn't have that going for me, I'd have to move elsewhere. It's just one of those small towns that can rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there too long. Excluding a handful of doctors, lawyers, and Georgia Power Company employees, the only employment opportunities in the area are Walmart, fast food, and a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town is a massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I enjoy hiking with my dog, but it can sometimes be an unnerving experience. It's about a 10-mile drive from town with no cell phone service or homes for miles. In the past, there have been a lot of vehicle break-ins at the trailheads. The gravel parking lots often glitter with bits of broken glass from car windows. Sometimes there are really shady people hanging around these trailheads or driving on the Forest Service roads. These roads are rough, meant for 4x4 vehicles, but you'll see beat-up $500 cars barreling down them. Some of the people in these cars look like extras from a gritty crime show. All that being said, it's still a great place to camp if you're careful. A few years ago, 2 of my friends and I decided to go play paintball in the national forest. We turned it into a camping trip so we could play the next morning too. After a day of shooting paintballs at one another, we drove a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up all the spots in that area. Since it was the only camping spot we were familiar with, we decided to keep looking. It was getting late, so we drove for about another hour, going deeper into the woods. By this time, it was getting dark, and we were starting to worry about finding a place to camp. We turned off onto an unfamiliar road that wasn't in great shape. It looked like the Forest Service had used a backhoe to block it with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. Despite this, it seemed like off-road vehicles had been driving over the mound, so it was worn down. Our F-150 had decent clearance, so we went over it too. On the other side was an old gravel road, mostly clear of debris. A few miles down the road, we came across an opening near a small creek. There were blue tarps hanging over a plywood table nailed to a tree, which seemed odd. It was dark by then, and we didn't want to keep searching for another spot, so we decided to set up camp. We kept the truck's lights on as we pitched the tent. After setting up, I noticed a lot of trash in the woods nearby. I picked up a green bottle and saw it was labeled as a home and garden insecticide. I figured someone had been dumping garbage out there, though it was strange for someone to dump trash more than an hour from the nearest home. We set up camp, had some beers, and made chili from scratch. By this time, it was around 11 p.m. While eating, we noticed a faint glow coming from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering through the trees, but the angles didn't make sense. It wasn't a bright light or moving, more like the glow of a city far away. Since there were no other access roads nearby, we ruled out other campers. The hill was about a quarter mile from our campsite, so we decided to investigate. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have done this, but we'd had a few rum and cokes. Jacob and I decided to check it out while our other friend Isaac stayed behind to pop some popcorn over the fire. As we walked toward the light, we noticed something strange. All the trees in the area had their bark stripped off in a circle around their trunks. It didn't look like beaver damage. It was just too consistent and widespread. Jacob joked about a ghost beaver, and we kept walking. When we got to the top of the hill, Jacob tripped and shouted, "Oh, sh!" Suddenly, the light went out. We froze, looked at each other, and decided we didn't need to know what it was after all. We walked back in silence, frequently glancing over our shoulders. When we were a couple of 100 feet from the campsite, I saw Isaac walking around. He was wearing a hooded coat we hadn't seen before and carrying his paintball gun. That seemed odd, but we figured he was just on edge. When we reached the fire, Isaac stumbled out of the tent and vomited. He'd had more rum and cokes after we left. We asked why he'd been wandering around with his paintball gun. He looked confused and said, "They're locked in the truck. Did you unlock it?" We checked the truck and everything was still locked away. Isaac swore he hadn't left the tent. We quickly packed up, leaving the tent and sleeping bags behind, and headed back to my house. On the way out, we noticed the metal barrier was back in place, blocking the road. No one wanted to get out, so I slowly pushed it aside with the truck. As we drove away, a vehicle with its lights off began following us. It stayed about 1,000 feet behind, only visible when the moonlight hit it. After about 45 minutes, we made it to the main road and headed home. I've since driven past that metal barrier, and it's always in place. I'll never go back down that road again. My dad and I would occasionally go hunting together when I was a kid. I was 14, and my dad knew a guy who owned what seemed to be half of Georgia. I mean, the amount of property this guy owned was ridiculous. He let people hunt there if he trusted you, and if he liked you, he'd let you camp out there for a couple of nights if you wanted. He always made sure we had a way to call for help before we did it. I loved camping out there more than I did just going hunting for a few hours and then coming home. I liked the woodsman feel of living out in the woods. We woke up early one morning and I hiked into the woods. It was still dark when we got to our stand. We didn't see or hear anything, not even birds. I remember my dad commenting on it, and looking back, it should have been a sign. Frustrated, we packed up and looked for a spot to camp. We would set up again later that evening. Dad suggested that we go deeper in for better chances of seeing something, so that's exactly what we did. We hiked for a few hours, found a clearing, and set up a small camp. We got settled and passed the time freaking ourselves out by talking about Bigfoot and other woodland creatures. We hiked a ways away from camp, set up our blind, and waited again. Nothing. We got back, and our tent had been pulled up and laid flat. Not in a neat way, but it was just kind of lying there. We thought it was just wind or something. Maybe we didn't put it upright and it collapsed. So in the moment, we really didn't think much of it. Since we didn't see or hear anything all day, we decided to leave the following day and try again later that week. We settled in for the night, built a really small fire, and just relaxed. Again, not even birds were making a sound. I remember thinking how odd it was to be this deep into the woods and only hearing one or two birds the whole trip. Oh well, maybe we were making too much noise and scared everything off. We went to sleep soon after settling in. It was pitch black in the middle of the night when I woke up for some reason. I tried to go back to sleep. I was in that half awake, half asleep phase when I heard laughter. I kind of jolted awake, but didn't hear it anymore. So I figured I was dreaming. I lay back down. A few minutes later, I heard it again. It continued and got pretty loud this time. I woke up now, and this time my dad was up too. He whispered and asked, "Did you hear that?" And that's when my heart dropped. I heard the laughing too. It wasn't a dream. We both heard it again, but it was faint. Now that I'm actually awake, I'm paying attention to it. It sounded like several people laughing in unison. It wasn't cackling or hysterical laughter, but just kind of normal laughter. It didn't last for more than maybe 5 or 6 seconds. I've never felt that much fear before in my entire life. We didn't hear any more after that. Needless to say, we didn't get much sleep. As soon as the sun came up, you bet your ass we got out of there. My dad was convinced someone followed us and was just playing some kind of prank. That's why we didn't see anything when we were in the stand and blind. They were scaring off all the wildlife with their unmixed scent and being on the ground. He said this, but he didn't go back out there for over a month. When he finally did go back, he mentioned it to the guy who owned the property. The guy wouldn't let my dad hunt there anymore and didn't tell him why either. My dad thinks he made the guy think my dad was actually crazy or something. I guess it's possible. For someone to afford us out there must have been legit ninjas, though, because we went out before daybreak. Nobody but the owner was parked out there that morning. There were dead leaves and sticks everywhere. When they decided to laugh, it came from different spots. I never heard one footstep. Sorry if this isn't really what you're looking for. It's one of my best stories. Even if nobody I tell believes me, I still get goosebumps. I needed to get away from the city, so I found the oldest cabin I could rent out in a far part of the woods. It was miles away from anything, surrounded by trees and complete silence. The cabin looked ancient, with dark, worn-out wood that creaked whenever the wind blew. Inside, it was just as basic. No electricity, only an old stove that used wood and a few candles. The floor was uneven, and the air smelled of damp wood and age. The first night was quiet, but on the second day, strange things started happening. It began when I went out to collect firewood. I saw a stack of logs already cut and neatly piled up against the cabin wall. I hadn't done it, and I was sure nobody else was around. The closest town was miles away, and I hadn't seen anyone since I got there. That night, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like it was trying to tear the cabin apart. I could hear branches snapping outside and the old wood groaning under the pressure. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard something, a light tapping, like someone was knocking on the walls. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I found something else strange. The front door was wide open, swinging on its rusty hinges. I knew I had locked it before bed. The ground outside was wet and muddy from the storm, but there were no footprints leading to or from the door. It didn't add up. I felt like someone was watching me. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I decided to take a walk, hoping some fresh air would help. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something odd. There were no sounds, no birds, no bugs, nothing. Just the crunch of my footsteps on the leaves. The deeper I went, the more I felt like something was pulling me in a certain direction. I stumbled across an old trail that I hadn't seen before. It was overgrown, almost hidden, but something about it made me keep walking. I followed it for what felt like hours until I reached a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was another cabin, even older and more broken down than the one I was staying in. It looked like no one had touched it for decades, maybe longer. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The door to this cabin was hanging open, just like mine had been. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was covered in dirt and broken wood. It was dark inside, but something in the corner caught my eye. It was an old, cracked mirror, the glass dirty and cloudy. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were faint handprints on the glass, like someone had pressed their hands against it from the inside. My heart started pounding. I turned to leave, but something stopped me in my tracks. In the reflection of the mirror, I saw the shape of a person standing behind me. I spun around, but there was nobody there. The cabin was empty, just like it was when I walked in. I looked back at the mirror, and the figure was gone. I didn't waste any time. I ran out of there as fast as I could, heading back to my cabin, thinking I'd be safe there. But when I got back, something was off. The firewood was gone. The door was shut tight, and the windows were closed. It was like I had never left, but I knew I had. My head was spinning as I tried to figure out what was going on, but nothing made sense. I knew I couldn't stay there another night. I quickly packed my stuff and left, driving away from that cabin as fast as possible. As I reached the edge of the woods, I looked in my rearview mirror, and my heart nearly stopped. In the distance, I could see that old cabin I found deep in the woods. It was standing right where my cabin had been. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but then, right before my eyes, it vanished, like it was never there at all. The worst part was when I glanced at the passenger seat. The old mirror from the cabin was sitting there, the glass covered in fresh handprints. I was in my last year before retiring from the Army and was going through a divorce. My soon-to-be ex-wife went back to Texas with my 2 girls, and I planned to move closer to them once my retirement was official. I rented a small 2-bedroom in Tennessee in a town called Indian Mound. Indian Mound was out of the way and really isolated. My commute sucked, but it was cheap and peaceful. I had no neighbors. Across the street was conservation land for miles. On one side and around the back of the property was the swamp. The closest house was out of shouting distance. I enjoyed living there initially, as I'd lived in the suburbs, and all the noise, people, and traffic drove me absolutely crazy. One night, I came home around 1 a.m. from a concert in Nashville. It was early spring, and it was somewhat foggy. The driveway dipped down, and the house was about 1/8 of a mile away from the road. As I pulled in, I saw a huge black dog standing in the front yard. It stood with its head up and its tail straight up as well, fixed on me. I slowly pulled my car up, unsure of what to do next, when it turned and ran into the swamp. I didn't really think much of it and went back inside. Over the following few months, things began happening at night. I always woke up around 3 or so in the morning, thinking I heard voices outside my window. Sometimes it sounded like people whispering to each other, but I couldn't quite understand what they were saying. Sometimes I would also hear footsteps and movement outside. I thought it was maybe a deer or that dog I saw, but when I looked out, I would see nothing. This type of stuff continued for months and months. Another night, I woke up to a noise and saw that it was 2:57 a.m. A bright white light shone through the porch glass doors. I ran into the kitchen and looked through a small sink window, and it looked like someone was out in the swamp shining a spotlight. It was one of those high-powered lights used in search and rescue, blinding and lit up the whole kitchen. As I opened up the back door and ran out onto the porch, yelling I was going to call the cops, the light suddenly went out. I heard someone moving away from the house and back into the swamp. The cops came out and took a report. They told me to ensure my doors were locked and to call if anything else happened. I was hyper vigilant for the next few days, checking behind me when I was coming and going. I slept with the shades drawn and doors locked. The footsteps around the house continued, and some nights I thought I could hear a dog panting outside my window, although I never found tracks or saw signs of an animal in the morning. Things did die down for a while, but about 3 months away from the end of my lease, I woke up at 3 in the morning, scared out of my mind. I was dreaming and heard a woman calling my name. I opened my eyes and realized it was a dream, but then I heard my name being called again, clear as day. I shot up, got out of bed, and turned on the lights. I checked in the closet, under the bed, and opened my bedroom door, listening out into the hallway. I couldn't hear anything. I was about to cut the lights and go back to bed when something pounded on my front door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was like someone was bashing the door with a sledgehammer. I yelled out that I had a gun and to get thee off my property, saying I'd call the cops and would blow your head off before they got here. The pounding stopped. The cops came out again and took another report. There was no damage to the door or any footprints around my property. It all just stopped after that. I did buy a 9mm, but the rest of my time renting there went without incident. I'm now back in Texas in an apartment complex in the burbs, and I don't mind. The backwoods of Tennessee were a very creepy place. Weird things happen in the Appalachian Mountains. They're as old as time itself, and the people who have lived there will be the first to tell you that it could be otherworldly. Sometimes you just have to turn a blind eye for the sake of your own sanity and kind of be like, yup, this is just how it is. I grew up in a small town outside Pisgah National Forest. Lots of waterfalls, great hikes, beautiful views. It's an amazing place to be, especially during the summer. But what happened to me was in the dead of winter when I was around 17. Before I dive into this, let me preface it by saying that at the time I had just gotten my very first prescription for glasses and wasn't used to keeping them on all the time. Though my vision was a bit blurry, I knew something was there that day. So when I was 17, I decided to do my senior project on nature photography, and what better place to take some photos than the forest? I asked my mom if she'd drive me to Pisgah and let me take those pictures. As we wound through the woods, it was winter, so the trees were bare and the sky was gray. It was still a fairly pretty day, and I just wanted some pictures of the local flora. My mom pulls over to let me walk down a trail I had been down 100 times. After a short walk through the woods, you'd end up at the riverbank. The way the bank curved, you could walk along the little stony shore a little ways past the trail. Mind you, I was wearing a bright orange raincoat, so I was incredibly visible. I'm crouching down to take a picture of a cool little railroad spike that had been sticking out of the earth for years, and all of a sudden, I realize there's no noise, scarily silent. No birds chirping, no nature sounds, nothing. It was like I didn't even hear the sound of water flowing. As this is happening, I suddenly realize exactly how visible and vulnerable I am. If you've ever experienced that primal sort of fear, you know what I mean. It was like alarm bells went off in my head. Danger, danger. As I'm sitting there, this feeling washed completely over me. I start to hear the crunching of footsteps. Again, all the trees were bare, so there really wasn't any foliage to block my view. I hear these footsteps that sound like 2 feet getting closer and closer to the river on the opposite side of the bank. I'm watching it very closely, unable to move. Whatever I saw was all gray and definitely not human, but tall and appeared to be walking on 2 legs. It was getting closer and closer. Right as it was about to reach the riverbank, I snapped out of that trance and turned and hightailed it back. I have never been more scared or ran that fast in my life. I booked it back to my mom's car, and obviously I was out of breath. Now she's asking me, what happened? What happened? After I explained it to her, She looked very worried and said that while she'd been down the trail, she got this weird sudden fear that something was wrong. It was actually about to come find me when I ran back. We left after that, and to this day, sometimes we'll talk about it, but we still have no real explanation. I told my boyfriend the story, and he insisted it could have been a skinwalker. I have no idea what it was, and although I wish I'd gotten a better look, I'm also glad I ran away when I did. Has anyone experienced anything like this in a similar area, or anywhere for that matter? Several years ago, my friend Sean, Melanie, and I got really interested in geocaching. They had a new GPS unit that they just had to try out with all its fancy features and light-up buttons. We did a few local caches to get the hang of it, then decided we could totally handle the expert-rated tough ones. This led us to northeastern Connecticut, an area called the Quiet Corner. There isn't much civilization out there, just a lot of wooded roads with houses spaced widely apart and hidden among the trees. It was an overcast and misty day, which added to the isolation we felt from the world. We arrived at the first cache, which was in the middle of a one-way bridge. The bridge connected two causeways over a wooded pond and had steel guardrails. The cache was attached to the rail by a magnet, dangling out over the water. It took us about 20 minutes to find it. During that time, a car driven by a disheveled older man drove by 3 times. The first time, we noticed him because he looked unkempt. The second time, we figured he was lost. The third time, we got chills down our spines. We had just found the cache, and our thoughts quickly changed from hooray, we win, to let's get the hell out of here. Unfortunately for us, this was what's known as a multi-cache. You had to find the first one, which gave you coordinates to the next, and so on. The next cache was a few miles away, and we were more than happy to leave our current location. We arrived at the second location, which was deep in the woods near the Rhode Island border. We were very close to a state park, and being on the border meant even less civilization. We got out of the car and searched along an abandoned rail line to find the cache. While we were in the trees, we heard a single car go by and headed deeper into the woods toward the cache. This one was easy to find. As we returned to our car, a vehicle approached from the direction of the border and began to slow down. It was him, miles from where we'd last seen him. He had clearly been the car we heard earlier. Serious concern set in. Who was this guy, and what did he want with us? Thankfully, there were a few houses nearby, so he drove off. We assumed that whatever he was planning, he wasn't going to do it in front of witnesses. We decided to plug in the next set of coordinates and take a very roundabout route at high speeds, hoping to lose him. Sean is a bit of a maniac driver anyway, so you can imagine the whiteness of our knuckles as he kicked it up a notch. I swear, if I ever find myself needing a getaway driver, I'm calling him. After a while, we all figured we'd lost him. When we reached our next destination, a remote section of the rail trail miles from the previous locations, there was no one behind us and no signs of anything remotely human except our own car. The road, once paved, had turned to dirt. It was just us, the trees, and the fog, which had settled in thicker on the drive over. We got out and felt like we were finally safe. We began to walk into the woods and had gone maybe 100 feet when we heard the sound of tires on gravel. Quickly, we darted off the trail and hid in the bushes. It was him. His car seemed to take an eternity to pass as he slowly inspected our vehicle. Finally, he drove away, disappearing around a bend in the road. Knowing we only had a short window of time, we ran for the car, got in, and tore off in the opposite direction. Fortunately, my brother-in-law's parents lived nearby. Although they were away on a cruise, we pulled into their long driveway and hid the car behind some shrubbery. Now, a bit about Sean. He's a huge guy, about 6'3", with hair and a beard that make him look like Hagrid from Harry Potter. He wears trench coats everywhere and is a fan of H.P. Lovecraft. For fun, he likes to read passages from the Necronomicon. He can be very intimidating to those who don't know him. As you might expect, his car trunk was full of bizarre supplies: a baseball bat, several cleavers, a screwdriver fashioned into an embalming hook, and various rusty cast iron hatchets. His car was essentially a one-man traveling horror show. Once we'd hidden the car, we all armed ourselves with items from Sean's trunk and waited. About 5 minutes later, our stalker returned. He drove by 3 more times in the next 10 minutes. After what felt like an eternity, but was really only half an hour, we decided he was probably gone for good. We finished the geocache, which actually had some cool prizes in it, and never saw our stalker again. That was probably for the best. Sean is very protective of Melanie and would probably have gutted the guy on the spot. Still, it was the creepiest experience of my life. In summer 2020, my partner and I, both in our early 20s, decided to take a road trip to Vancouver, Canada, and then stay at Golden Ears Provincial Park. We enjoyed camping, had spring break, and wanted to do something different to make the most out of our vacation. My partner had never been out of the U.S., and it seemed like a crazy new experience for both of us. It was a 6-day trip with Airbnbs in each stop, and the grand finale was a reserved campsite at Golden Ears, which was really close to the water, Owlet Lake. We packed terribly. I had a giant tent, brought a bunch of fruits and veggies to eat healthily, stored them in a cooler that was way too small, and brought a cutting board and knife to break up snacks while driving. We started in California, switching off driving our bright red Ford Fiesta. We drove through Oregon and Washington and made it to Vancouver. We spent a day or two in each state, drank a little too much, and stayed out way too late. Canada was the best part, and Owlet Lake felt like walking in a painting. We walked barefoot on the rocks with our toes in the freezing cold lake, hiked around, and saw a beautiful waterfall where we saw a couple taking pictures of each other for an hour. We started modeling the same poses from afar. Everything was perfect. The campsite was empty except for the other couple, and we went to bed early that night. It was quiet. I woke up to crackling sounds outside my tent. My partner was still asleep and snoring. I didn't think much of it because it was pitch black, probably an animal. The crackling continued closer to the tent. I sat up and grabbed my phone. The brightness came on, and I turned it off, almost blinding myself with the light. In those 2 seconds, I could make out a person right outside our tent. I froze and sat up. They weren't moving and were close enough to unzip the tent. I started poking my partner because I had no idea what to do. I woke them up and said, "There's someone outside the tent." Then I heard footsteps, quiet footsteps, walking out of our campsite. My partner started saying, What are you talking about?" in a sleepy haze. A truck or a car was parked right outside our camping area. No one was near our campsite. It started up and then drove off. They didn't turn their lights on until they turned the corner and were well out of view. I couldn't really make out much, but it definitely looked like a truck. I was shaking, and my partner couldn't piece together what was happening. I wanted to leave, but the Golden Ears gate locks until about 7 or 8 a.m. It was 1 a.m., so we were going to be there for the rest of the night. We moved to the Ford Fiesta and tried to sleep in the tightly packed car. She fell asleep immediately and thought I was paranoid. Maybe it could have been a park ranger, but it seemed way too weird of behavior for a park ranger, so I ended up sitting there wide awake for about 2 hours, cars locked. I wanted to sleep, but I couldn't. I was sitting in the passenger seat, and my partner was in the driver's seat, fast asleep. It was now 3 a.m. I was half awake when I saw a car slowly driving up the road, its lights off as it rounded the corner. It had to have been the same truck. I was scared, but adrenaline was pumping. It slowly rounded the corner and pulled up directly in front of our campsite once again, in the same spot. I felt like I was going to throw up. Outside, I had no weapons except for that same knife we used for the fruit and veggies, so I grabbed the knife and tried to make myself look angry, crazy, and big. I sat straight up in the passenger seat, holding that knife, keeping it at eye level, and stared deadpan at the truck in the pitch black, just like the farmer in Grant Wood's American Gothic painting. The truck stopped and turned off. A light shone directly into my face from inside the truck. I stared back, terrified, clutching my bright red Ford Fiesta and my large kitchen knife, not blinking. The truck started up again, turned on its lights, and they stayed on, blinding me. The truck pulled out, turned around, and went back where it came from. My heart was pounding the entire time. I woke my partner and said, "We need to get the hell out of here." We packed up by throwing things into the car and sat there awake until 6 a.m. We drove home and didn't stop, constantly rehearsing and trying to make sense of the situation. We ultimately decided we just needed some sleep. I've posted this on another thread back in August, but I figured I'd share it again. Of the countless hours I've spent in the woods, it's the one time for only a few seconds that I can't explain. I distance hike when I can, and sometimes this means getting up early or staying out late to get as many miles in as possible. Sometimes that means walking in pitch dark with a low-light headlamp, and it gets spooky. I grew up in the woods of this area. I've slept under a canopy of stars more nights than I can even count. I've trekked thousands of miles of trails, riverbanks, lakeshores, ridges, bottoms, bogs, and creeks. I've hunted game. I'm establishing this because it's important you understand. I've heard, seen, and smelled everything this region has to offer in the way of wilderness. My scariest experience, though, happened around 4:30 in the morning. It was late spring, so the first morning light wouldn't be visible in the treetops for maybe another 30 to 45 minutes. Another hour passed until sunrise, and I was on mile 5. I was in a low bottom that was wedged between two steep ridges. The trail I was on was narrow, muddy, and completely hemmed in by thick underbrush with young maple and old oak growth. I was focused on the small light from my headlamp, just one step after the other, completely zoned out. Then I heard a loud crack, and I froze solid. This is the part I have trouble describing. At 4:30 in the springtime, it means I'm the only thing making noise. No birds chirping, nothing. Dead quiet. Mid-step, I froze when fight or flight kicked in. You have these immediate instinct thoughts. The thought that instantly flashed in my mind as I stood there, balancing myself in silence was, if I hear that again, I'm turning around and going back the way I came. Fast. Why? Because that sound was not a branch breaking. It wasn't deadfall. It wasn't a widowmaker. I was damn sure I just heard something intentional. Hearing it twice? That meant get the hell out of here. To describe it as best as I can, it sounded like a decent-sized wooden stick being violently whacked against a smallish tree, more a fungal bat-sized stick than a baseball bat. The distinction in my head being that this sound was a crack, not a thud or a thump. I've described it as explosive in the past because it was so sudden and terribly loud. I had the sense it was about 50 yards directly in front of me. It was loud and it was clear. Now, as I stood there completely spooked, I realized the soon-to-be worst part of my situation. I knew where the sound came from, and I knew where the trail went. In about 30 yards, I was going to come to a 180-degree turn and start up the ridge, away from the creek. This meant that as soon as I got the courage to move toward the noise, I was going to have my back turned to it and get up that ridge. And that made me very nervous. My head somewhere between a methane murderer and Bigfoot bludgeoning. Minutes passed. I just breathed my foggy breath into my glasses and listened. Still nothing. Still dead quiet. I've got maybe 20 or 30 minutes until first light. I cranked up the headlamp and started to slowly creep toward the 180 turn. When you wear a headlamp in the woods at night, every tree branch in front of you casts a big black moving shadow on the trail, and this definitely didn't help. I get to the turn, and quickly make the bend. I'm moving pretty fast at this point, trying to be quiet, taking tiny, shallow breaths so I can listen while humping it up the trail. Then I smell it. A stench hits me that I can't describe. I just imagine wet, rotten death. I've actually worked scenes where humans have expired in a past life as a firefighter, and this was like days-old decomposition, but it just smelled strange. I kept walking fast, and by the time I made it to the top of that ridge, I was huffing, and the first light was showing. But I didn't stop until full light was out and the birds were chirping. I've heard it all in our woods. I've smelled it all. I'm telling you, I don't know what the hell that was. Deadfall, especially with leaved-out branches, makes a lot of noise on the way down. I've heard it many times. I just don't know. This incident happened in 2017. I would love to know if anyone else has had a similar encounter, because I've never been able to shake the feeling that this individual is a serial predator of some kind. I've never been able to stop thinking about what happened. My then boyfriend and I were on a road trip during the winter of 2018. It took a day to visit Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona. For anyone who hasn't been there, you drive down a long road that winds through landscapes and exit at various stops along the way to view different points. We were there at maybe our second or third stop when we encountered the creep. This particular stop has a wide parking lot and a handful of large educational signs at either end, and a path that leads up to a historic site and various vantage points. As we made our way up the path to the main site, a man was coming down towards the parking lot. He looked pretty much exactly like Mr. Clean, but in a red t-shirt and jeans. He was tall, upwards of 6'2". As we passed each other, he muttered something odd under his breath, though it was clearly intended to get our attention. My boyfriend turned around and asked him what he said. The man looked at us almost stunned for a moment before he seemed to decide to come up with something else to say. He pointed into the distance and asked, no joke, "What's that over there?" All there was over there was some kind of utility box on the road through the park and desert. We brushed him off and said we didn't know, then continued up the path. When he called out, "See you later, pretty girl," there's hardly a woman alive who hasn't had something like this said to her 10,000 times before. But this felt unusually sinister and set my nerves on edge. We both decided to just ignore him, though, and headed up to the rest of the site. After 15 to 20 minutes of looking around, I finally had to admit to my boyfriend that I felt like we were being watched. He nodded and said that guy hasn't left and has been watching us this entire time. From where we were standing on a hill, we could see the parking lot. I noticed our creep standing near an educational sign at the far edge of the parking lot, clearly positioned to see up the hill at us. We were both bugged by it, but we resolved not to let it ruin our time or to get too bent out of shape about it. We took our time at the stop, shook off the nerves, and by the time we went back to the parking lot, he was gone. We drove another mile or two to the next vantage point, which included a number of petroglyphs on a cliff wall that you can see using binoculars. You have to take a narrow road into the parking lot, which creates a bit of a bottleneck. As we were about to enter, a blue RAV4 pulled in front of us and blocked us from coming in. It was, in fact, that same creep. After a few moments of intense eye contact with my boyfriend, who would later say, without a trace of exaggeration, he felt like he wanted to kill him, the guy slowly pulled away and let us enter the lot. He left, so we told ourselves we were overthinking it. But I decided to spend a good long time where we were to let him get well ahead of us so we wouldn't keep running into each other. Our next stop, a mile loop hike, was about 3.5 miles away. We figured we'd spend enough time at the petroglyphs that even if the guy was at our next destination, he'd either be close to done with the hike or leaving by then. Unfortunately, he waited for us about 2 miles up the road. we spotted that same blue RAV4 pulled over to the side of the road. The man was standing next to the car, sort of looking vaguely into the distance. The landscape is beautiful in the park, but even though there was nothing especially spectacular about this spot, maybe he was just taking it all in away from the crowds. As we drove by, I looked behind us, and he turned to watch us, staring at our car driving away until we rounded a corner and could no longer see him. When we got to the parking lot and got out to take the hike, we were both feeling a little rattled. My boyfriend, who normally tolerates creepiness in others to a fault, was so shaken by the vibes this guy gave off that he actually stashed a little window-breaking hammer from his car safety kit inside his hoodie pocket, just in case we felt we needed it for self-defense. I guess that sounds nuts now, but it's just one of those things we all do to feel a little safer when we get creeped out. The hike itself is down at the bottom of this kind of valley. You walk down a steep, winding path to the bottom, where the path splits and forms a circuit around this area that includes all these cool little hillocks of painted rock dotted with petrified wood. We made it all the way down to the beginning of the loop. We noticed the guy up at the top of the cliff off the parking lot, looking down our way. We were about halfway around the loop when we saw the guy at the base of the hill about to start. We were relieved because we knew we'd be out of there before him this time, and felt like we could finally shake him and stop feeling weirded out. For most of the loop, you can see the whole path and the whole hill up to the parking lot. But for the middle section of the walk, you're shielded from view behind these little hillocks and different topography. When we emerged near the end of the loop, we were still feeling good, but took a quick look to place our creep before heading back. We didn't see him anywhere. Maybe he decided not to do the walk, or maybe he was behind one of those little hills. As we made our way back up the steep path, we noticed him at the top, just waiting by this informational sign. Switchback after switchback, he stayed put, apparently intently reading the sign. As we got closer, we noticed he was now holding something. When we got to the top of the path, where we knew we'd have to pass within inches of him again, we tightened up, locked arms, and prepared to march right past as quickly as we could. Even though lots of people were walking by him coming and going, he waited for us to cross his path. Turns out that what he now had in his hands was a windshield washing squeegee and a spray bottle. There was something in it. As we tried to walk past him, he turned to us and said, "Hey, can you help me? I'm running out of time," and started to hold up the spray bottle and squeegee. My boyfriend was in no mood and said, "Nope, leave us alone," in a pretty nice but harsh tone. As we kept walking, the guy, smiling, replied, "Well, you too. Nice ass, though, both of you," and started determinedly following us. He was gaining on us by the time we got to the car, and I barely made it in and locked the door before he was right next to my window, staring at me. Even though I was freaked the hell out and my instinct was just to keep my head down, I didn't want to give him the upper hand and let him make me cower. So I looked up and stared right into his eyes. Just thinking about it makes my stomach turn. He was right up next to my window, staring and unblinking with his hand up in a frozen wave, smiling. When I looked into his eyes, the first thought I had was that he wanted to skin me alive. It sounds completely insane to say, but I think anyone who's had an encounter with someone like this will completely relate. When someone means you harm, there's something that kicks in and you feel it deep, in a strange way. My boyfriend had the presence of mind to start snapping pictures of the guy, who then moved around our car to try to keep us from driving away. My boyfriend started revving the engine to try to get him to move. It didn't work. He just kept blocking us. So we started inching the car forward. Still, he didn't move. We tapped him, and he stumbled back a little, but just kept standing there. Then we noticed there was a family, a couple of cars over, staring at us over their lunch. The creep noticed too, smiled that nasty smile, and then just gave us enough room to get out of our parking spot. As we sped away, as we passed the family, the man in the front seat gave us an encouraging nod. It was sort of like, "We saw it. We're watching him. We've got your back." I immediately called the park office and told them what was going on. They sent a ranger out to check on the guy. We headed to Winslow, Arizona, stopped at a bar to have a drink, and tried to chill out. We were so freaked out that we actually checked the car for a tracking device, which also, I know, sounds crazy. But it was one of those situations where the vibe the guy was giving off turned the emotion of the events way past what seems normal. Later that night, we got a call from the ranger who told us they ended up having to arrest the guy for disorderly conduct and asked us to provide a statement of our experience. We tried to find more about him or what happened after we left, but haven't been successful. I'm so curious if this guy sounds familiar to anyone, especially the weird window washing ploy. In all our adrenaline, we had all kinds of wacky theories. Maybe there was some poison in the bottle, or the squeegee had a knife hidden in it or something. I'm sure we were exaggerating, but I've never been able to stop feeling like we dodged a bullet with that guy. The air was cool when I got to the campsite, a remote spot deep in the woods. It had been years since I was last here with my ex-wife, and now it was just me. I set up the tent, started a fire, and tried to push away the awkward memories of her. Night fell quickly and the forest grew dark. The fire crackled softly, casting the only light in the growing darkness. I was starting to relax when I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was hard to tell where it was coming from. It could have been the wind or a stray branch. I ignored it and focused on the warmth of the fire. As the night went on, the tapping grew louder and more persistent. It sounded like someone was knocking or tapping out a pattern. I checked outside the tent, but saw nothing. I went back inside, but the sound was still there, now joined by a strange scraping noise. I tried to ignore it, but sleep was impossible. The noises kept getting louder and more aggressive. The tent seemed to be shaking a little, though there was no wind. I finally unzipped the flap to check outside. The night was still and silent, and the fire was dying down. I walked around the edge of the campsite, looking for anything that might explain the noises. As I neared the edge of the clearing, I spotted something odd. A shallow hole partly covered with leaves and dirt. I could see a corner of a wooden box sticking out. My heart raced as I dug up the box. It was old and the wood was damp. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were personal items, photos, letters, and a diary. The stuff looked like it had been buried for a long time. There was also a map with a marked point pointing to a spot nearby. A cold shiver ran down my spine when I saw that the diary had entries about the campsite and the area around it. The last entry was from around the time of our last visit. It talked about someone watching from the woods and the need to leave before it was too late. Fear gripped me. I quickly packed up, deciding it was best to get out of there before anything else happened. As I drove away from the campsite, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woods were dark and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something that had been waiting for me to dig up the box. I never went back to that campsite, and I never told anyone about what I found. The sense of dread stayed with me, a constant reminder that some places hold dark secrets. To this day, I wonder if the things watching from the woods are still there, waiting for the next person to uncover what should have stayed buried. I decided to go camping at a spot my neighbor had mentioned. It wasn't a place many people knew about, which made it seem like the perfect escape. A quiet weekend away from the city noise sounded just right. I left early in the morning, driving through narrow, twisting roads that were lined with thick trees. As I got closer, the trees seemed to grow taller and denser, making the road darker. The road turned into a bumpy dirt path, and soon I reached the campsite, a small open area surrounded by woods. The only sound was a distant stream, barely breaking the silence. I set up my tent and started a small fire. The day passed quietly, with nothing but the sounds of birds and rustling leaves around me. As the sun set, the temperature dropped, and the woods grew even darker. The light from the fire only lit up a small area around me, leaving everything else in deep shadow. That's when I noticed something strange. The woods, which had been full of noises from animals and rustling leaves, suddenly went quiet. It wasn't a normal kind of quiet. Everything just stopped all at once. I felt a cold chill go through me, but I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up to small sounds like something moving outside the tent. The noises were quiet, like something light stepping on leaves. I kept telling myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but with every noise, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. In the early morning hours, I heard something I couldn't ignore. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, careful, and definitely human, moving around my campsite. They were trying to be quiet as if they didn't want to be heard. My heart started racing as I lay there, holding my breath, listening to the slow steps. I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps circled my tent, stopping every few seconds. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing, hoping that whoever it was would just leave. But they didn't. Instead, they stopped right next to my tent, so close that I could hear them breathing. I waited, not knowing what to do. Every second felt like it stretched on forever. Then, without warning, the footsteps started moving away, slowly at first, then faster, until they faded into the distance. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night, too scared to move or make a sound. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I packed up my things as fast as I could. I didn't even stop to eat. I just wanted to get out of there. I left the campsite and made my way back to the car, feeling like something was watching me the entire time. The woods, which had seemed so peaceful the day before, now felt like they were hiding something dangerous. When I finally reached my car, I felt a rush of relief. I threw my gear in the back, got in, and started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away, the feeling of being watched slowly fading as I put more distance between myself and that place. But later, when I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. It wasn't just in the woods. Whatever it was, it followed me back. I checked the locks on my doors, double-checking each one, but the uneasy feeling never left. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft creak outside my window, like someone stepping on a loose board. I froze, barely breathing as the sound moved closer, the same slow, careful footsteps I'd heard in the woods. It wasn't the woods that weren't as empty as they seemed. Sometimes what follows you home doesn't just stay outside. It's already inside, waiting for the right moment to let you know you were never alone. And this time, there's nowhere to run. I had always wanted to go camping in the French countryside. There was something about the untouched woods, the quiet little towns, and the vast open fields that felt so peaceful. After working nonstop for months, I decided to take a week off and finally do it. I picked a spot deep in the woods, not far from a small village where there weren't many people around. It seemed like the perfect place to relax. The first 2 days were calm. The trees stood tall and still, with just the sound of leaves moving every now and then. At night, it was cool but not freezing, and the stars above stretched across the sky. I had everything I needed, set up my tent, and made simple meals over the fire. There wasn't anyone around for miles, and I liked that. It felt like I had the whole forest to myself. But on the third night, things started to feel different. As the sun went down, I realized the usual calm was gone. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. It felt like the forest was waiting for something. I tried to ignore it, but it left me feeling uneasy, like something wasn't right. I made dinner like I usually did and got into my tent once the fire went out. I wanted to sleep, but that feeling of something being wrong wouldn't go away. I lay in the dark, listening to the silence, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep from being so tired. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. The tent was completely dark, and at first I didn't know why I was awake. Then I heard it, a sound I couldn't ignore. Footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps, coming from just outside my tent. My heart was pounding, and I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. I didn't want to believe what I was hearing, but it was real. The footsteps got closer, circling around my tent. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, but the way the steps sounded, they were too slow, too heavy, too much like a person. I grabbed my flashlight, trying not to make any noise, and turned it on. The light flashed through the tent, and for a second, the steps stopped, and everything went quiet again. But my mind was racing. What if someone was out there? What were they doing? I listened, hoping it would go away, but after a few moments the steps started again, this time moving away, back into the forest. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my heart racing every time I thought I heard something, but the footsteps didn't come back. When the sun finally started to rise, I cautiously stepped out of my tent. There were no signs that anyone had been there. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing out of place. But that feeling that someone had been watching me stuck around. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, deciding I'd had enough of the French woods. On the drive back to the village, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Someone or something had been out there, walking around my camp. I kept trying to make sense of it, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. It didn't seem like something I could just brush off. A few days later, when I was back home, I did some digging online to see if I could find out more about the area. That's when I came across some old stories about people disappearing in that forest. Hikers and campers who went into the woods and never came back. No one ever found their bodies, and the local police had stopped looking after a while. That was all I needed to know. I'll never go back to that place, not even close. It felt like the forest was hiding something dark that I was lucky to escape from. I still wonder what was out there that night, circling my tent. But part of me thinks it was just a warning. Next time, I might not be so lucky. It was the fall of 2019, and I had been looking for a quiet place to clear my head. Work had been overwhelming, and I felt like I was drowning under the weight of deadlines and stress. A cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect escape, somewhere I could disconnect from everything and finally breathe. I found a rental listing online for a small cabin deep in the forests of northern Michigan, far from any towns or highways. It was described as secluded and peaceful, exactly what I was looking for. I packed light, just enough clothes for a week, some canned food, and a few books to keep me company. The drive out was long, but the further I got from the city, the lighter I felt. The air smelled fresher, the trees lining the winding road seemed endless, and the noise of civilization faded away until all I could hear was the hum of my car and the occasional rustle of leaves. When I finally reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. The cabin was smaller than I had expected, but it had a certain charm. It was made of weathered wood with a small porch out front and a single rocking chair that creaked in the breeze. There was a fire pit a few yards away and a small shed in the back. Though I had no plans to use it, I stepped inside and was immediately struck by how quiet it was. The only sound was the faint ticking of an old clock on the wall. The interior was simple. A small living room with a couch and a wood-burning stove, a tiny kitchen with outdated appliances, and a single bedroom with a bed that looked like it had seen better days. A handwritten note on the counter welcomed me and mentioned that there was no cell service, but the cabin had a landline for emergencies. That didn't bother me. I had come here to unplug anyway. The first 2 days passed without incident. I spent my time reading on the porch, hiking the nearby trails, and cooking simple meals. The solitude was exactly what I needed, and I felt like I was finally starting to unwind. But on the third night, things started to feel off. It began with the noises. At first, I chalked it up to the natural sounds of the forest: branches creaking in the wind, animals rustling in the underbrush. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew stranger. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard what sounded like footsteps on the gravel outside. I froze, my heart racing. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the deliberate pace of the steps didn't sit right with me. The next morning, I found nothing unusual outside. No footprints, no sign of anything that might have caused the noise. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. I decided to take a long hike to clear my head. The trail behind the cabin wound deep into the woods, and for the first hour, it was peaceful. But then I noticed something strange, a faint smell, like something rotting. It was faint at first, but as I walked, it grew stronger. I searched for the source, half expecting to find a dead animal, but I found nothing. The smell eventually faded, and I tried to push it out of my mind. That evening, as the sun set and the shadows grew long, the uneasiness returned. I decided to build a fire in the fire pit, hoping the warmth and light would push away the creeping sense of dread. As I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me whip my head around, but I saw nothing. Around midnight, I decided to head inside. As I was putting out the fire, I thought I saw movement in the woods, just a flicker of motion out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look, but whatever it was had disappeared. My pulse quickened, and I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. The next day, I considered leaving, but I told myself I was being paranoid, letting my imagination run wild. I had come here to escape stress, not to create new fears. So I stayed. I spent most of the day inside, reading and trying to distract myself. But by nightfall, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. I decided to check all the doors and windows to make sure everything was locked. As I was closing the curtains in the living room, I caught a glimpse of something outside, a figure standing just at the edge of the tree line. My breath caught in my throat. It was too dark to make out any details, but the silhouette was unmistakably human. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. I didn't dare turn on the lights, afraid of drawing attention to myself. I sat in the dark, clutching a flashlight and waiting. Hours passed, but the figure never approached the cabin. I told myself it could have been a trick of the light, my mind playing tricks on me. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside, large, unmistakably human footprints. They led from the tree line to the fire pit and then back into the woods. My stomach churned. Whoever it was had been watching me, standing just feet from where I had been sitting the night before. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things in a hurry, throwing them into my car without caring if they were organized. As I was about to leave, I noticed something strange on the porch, a small bundle of sticks tied together with twine. It hadn't been there the night before. My hands shook as I picked it up and examined it. There was nothing overtly threatening about it, but the fact that someone had left it there while I slept filled me with a deep, primal fear. I got in my car and drove away, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. Even as I reached the main road and the safety of civilization, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there in the woods, but I know one thing for certain: I'll never go back. It's strange how quickly the Amazon rainforest can turn from a place of wonder to something that feels like it wants you gone. I'd gone down there for work, part of a research project mapping deforestation patterns. It was 2019, and I was 31. I wasn't some inexperienced tourist. I had worked in forests before, mostly in the US, and I thought I knew what to expect. But the Amazon isn't like anywhere else. It swallows you whole in ways you can't even explain. Our team had set up a small research station about 20 meters from the nearest village. Calling it a cabin was generous. It was more like a large wooden shack. It had 4 walls, a roof, and just enough space for a couple of cots, a desk, and our equipment. At first, it seemed perfect. The thick canopy above kept the worst of the heat off, and the hum of the jungle felt almost calming. I even enjoyed the rainstorms that rolled in every afternoon. But then one night, everything changed. It started with rain, of course. In the Amazon, rain isn't a gentle patter. It's like the sky opens up and dumps the ocean on your head. That night was worse than usual. By sunset, the rain was pounding so hard on the roof, it felt like the wood might cave in. The sound was deafening, drowning out even the constant buzz of insects and the calls of distant animals. I was alone in the cabin that night. One of my colleagues had taken the boat downriver to get supplies, and the others were staying in the village for a few days. I didn't mind. I'd always liked solitude. But as the rain kept hammering down, I started to feel uneasy. The thing about being deep in the rainforest is how isolating it feels. No cell service, no roads, no one around for miles, just the endless trees and the knowledge that if something went wrong, you'd be on your own. I'd always thought I was okay with that. But that night, with the storm raging outside, the isolation started to feel more like a trap. Around midnight, I noticed something odd. The rain was still hammering down, but the usual jungle noises had stopped. No frogs, no crickets, nothing, just silence. At first, I thought maybe the storm had scared them off, but then I remembered that wasn't how it worked. Rain didn't silence the jungle, it usually made it louder. I turned off the lamp and sat still, listening. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling outside. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, like something moving slowly through the underbrush. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a tapir or an armadillo. But it didn't feel right. The sound was too steady, too deliberate. Grabbing my flashlight, I walked to the window and shone it out into the trees. The beam of light barely penetrated the rain, but I could see the immediate area around the cabin. Nothing. Just wet leaves and muddy ground. I told myself I was being paranoid and went back to the cot, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a loud thud. My heart was racing before I even opened my eyes. The sound had come from the back of the cabin. Sitting up, I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it toward the noise. The door was still shut, but something heavy had hit the wall. The thud came again, followed by another. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, like something was testing the strength of the cabin. I felt a cold sweat break out on my back. I wasn't armed apart from a small utility knife. My radio was useless in the storm. Forcing myself to move, I crept toward the back wall, trying to stay silent. I pressed my ear to the wood and listened. For a moment, there was nothing but the rain. Then I heard it, a low, wet sound like something breathing heavily. It wasn't an animal I recognized. It wasn't an animal at all. The thudding stopped and everything went silent again. I stood there frozen for what felt like hours. Finally, I decided to check outside. I told myself it was just a precaution, but the truth was I needed to know if whatever was out there was gone. I stepped outside into the rain, holding the flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other. The rain was so heavy I could barely see a few feet ahead, but I swept the beam across the area around the cabin. At first, it seemed normal, just mud and water pooling around the base of the trees. But then I saw them. Footprints. They were large, barefoot, and deep, like someone heavy had been walking in the mud. The tracks led from the back of the cabin into the trees. My stomach dropped. Whoever or whatever had made those tracks wasn't an animal. They were human, or close enough. I followed the tracks to the edge of the clearing, but they disappeared into the underbrush. The thought of going any further made my skin crawl. I backed away and returned to the cabin, locking the door behind me. For the rest of the night, I sat in the corner with the knife in my hand, listening to the rain and waiting for dawn. When the sun finally came up, the rain had stopped, and the jungle was alive again. Birds were calling, insects buzzing, everything back to normal. It almost felt like the night before had been a bad dream, but the footprints were still there, half filled with water, but unmistakable. I spent the day checking the area, but I found nothing else. No more tracks, no signs of who or what had been there. When my colleague returned later that afternoon, I didn't tell him what had happened. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. I stayed in the Amazon for another month, but I never felt safe after that night. Every time it rained, I found myself tensing up, listening for that thud on the wall. Nothing ever happened again, but the memory stayed with me. I've thought about it a lot since then, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just some local hunter passing through, curious about the cabin. Maybe it was something else entirely. I don't know. All I know is that the Amazon is a place that doesn't care about you. It doesn't want you there. And sometimes it lets you know. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to rent a cabin deep in the Appalachian woods. I had just turned 32, and life in the city had worn me down. The constant noise, endless deadlines, and suffocating crowds made me crave solitude. I wanted silence, a break from everything. So I found a cabin online that promised complete isolation, surrounded by nothing but trees and mountains. It seemed perfect. The cabin was in Tennessee, far from the nearest town. The website described it as rustic, which I took to mean no Wi-Fi and maybe a wood-burning stove. That was fine with me. I wasn't looking for luxury. I wanted peace. I packed lightly: clothes, some food, a flashlight, a book, and my hunting knife. I wasn't planning to hunt, but I figured it was a good idea to have it, just in case. I arrived in the late afternoon after driving for nearly 6 hours. The last stretch of the journey was along a narrow dirt road that twisted and turned through the forest. My small sedan struggled with the uneven terrain, and I couldn't help but think I should have rented an SUV. Still, I made it. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. The roof was mossy, the wood was weathered, and the windows looked a little warped, but it had a certain charm. There was no driveway, just a patch of dirt where I parked. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the only sounds were birds chirping and the distant rustle of leaves. It was exactly what I had hoped for. Inside, the cabin was simple: a single room with a bed, a small table, and a fireplace. There was a tiny kitchenette with a sink and an old propane stove. The bathroom was an outhouse a few yards behind the cabin. No electricity, no running water. It was primitive, but it felt right. I unloaded my things, lit a couple of oil lamps, and settled in. That first night, I sat by the fireplace, reading by the flickering light. The silence was almost overwhelming, but I welcomed it. I fell asleep easily, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. I didn't even notice the creaking sounds that came from the woods as the wind moved through the trees. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I had no phone signal, so I couldn't rely on GPS, but I had brought a map. The trails weren't well marked, but I figured I'd stick close to the cabin. I walked for hours, taking in the scenery. The forest was dense, with sunlight barely breaking through the canopy. I saw deer tracks, heard the distant call of a hawk, and even spotted a fox darting through the underbrush. By the time I returned, the sun was dipping low. I realized I had wandered farther than I intended and made a mental note to be more careful. As I approached the cabin, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a strange tension in the air. I brushed it off, chalking it up to my tired mind, and went inside. That night, I woke up suddenly. It was pitch black, and for a moment, I couldn't figure out what had startled me. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like leaves being disturbed. It was coming from outside, near the edge of the clearing. My first thought was animals, maybe raccoons or a deer. But the sound didn't move like an animal. It was too slow, too deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife, telling myself it was nothing. I opened the cabin door and shined the light toward the trees. The beam didn't reach far, but I saw nothing unusual. Still, the rustling continued, now seeming to circle the clearing. My heart pounded, and I closed the door, bolting it shut. The noise stopped after a while, and I eventually fell back asleep. In the morning, I found something that made my stomach twist. There were footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I hadn't been outside barefoot. The prints circled the cabin, stopping occasionally as if whoever made them had been standing and watching. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone else was camping nearby and had gotten lost. Maybe they were curious about the cabin. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. The cabin was miles from anything. I shook it off and decided to go about my day. I spent most of it chopping wood for the fireplace, trying to keep myself busy. That night, the noises came back. This time, it was more than rustling. I heard twigs snapping and what sounded like quiet footsteps. I stayed inside, clutching my knife and flashlight, too afraid to open the door. The sounds continued for hours, stopping and starting, always just beyond the edge of the clearing. In the morning, I found more footprints. They were closer to the cabin now, and there were more of them. I felt a knot of fear in my stomach. I decided to leave. I packed my things and loaded them into the car, but when I tried to start it, the engine wouldn't turn over. I checked under the hood and found nothing wrong. The car was old, but it had never given me trouble before. It didn't make sense. With no way to leave, I was stuck. I spent the day trying to figure out what to do. There was no phone signal, and the nearest town was too far to walk before dark. I decided to wait until morning and hike to the main road, hoping to flag down a passing car. That night, the noises were worse. They started earlier, just as the sun was setting. I heard heavy breathing outside the cabin, and at one point, something scratched at the door. I stayed up all night, sitting by the fireplace with my knife in hand. When dawn finally came, I felt a mix of relief and dread. I grabbed my backpack and started walking toward the main road. The forest felt different, darker, quieter. Every snap of a twig made me jump. After an hour, I realized I was lost. The trail I thought I was following had disappeared, and the trees all looked the same. I stopped to get my bearings, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing in the distance between the trees. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could tell they were watching me. I froze, my heart racing. Then they moved, disappearing into the shadows. I turned and ran, not caring which direction I went, as long as it was away from them. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they would burst. Eventually, I stumbled back into the clearing where the cabin sat. I had somehow gone in a circle. Desperate and out of options, I locked myself inside the cabin. I stayed there for 2 more days, surviving on the food I had left. The noises never stopped. Sometimes I heard footsteps, other times whispers. I never saw who or what it was, but I knew they were out there, waiting. On the 3rd day, I woke up to silence. No rustling, no footsteps, just the wind in the trees. I cautiously stepped outside, clutching my knife. My car was gone. The patch of dirt where it had been parked was empty, with no tire tracks leading away, just empty space. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I grabbed my backpack and started walking, not caring about the direction. Eventually, I stumbled onto the main road and flagged down a passing truck. The driver took one look at me and didn't ask any questions. I never went back to the cabin, and I never found out who or what had been out there. All I know is that something was watching me, and it wanted me gone. I've always found peace in working with my hands. There's something grounding about shaping raw wood into something useful and beautiful. Over the years, I've made furniture, repaired old barns, and restored cabins for clients who wanted a slice of rural nostalgia. But this time, it was different. I wasn't building for someone else. I was building for myself. It was 2018 when I bought the plot of land. It sat at the edge of a sprawling forest in northern Michigan, about 30 miles from the nearest town. No neighbors, no traffic, just miles of trees and the occasional deer. The property came cheap, mostly because of its isolation. That was fine by me. I needed a place to clear my head, escape the noise of the world, and pour myself into a project that mattered. The plan was simple: build a one-room cabin where I could work and live for a while. I'd make the furniture myself: tables, chairs, a bed frame, using wood from the forest around me. I figured it would take a few months of hard work, but I wasn't in a rush. The idea of being alone out there didn't bother me. If anything, it felt like a gift. I started the project in early April. The snow had just melted, and the ground was soft but workable. I parked my truck at the edge of the property, unloaded my tools, and set up a small tent where I'd sleep until the cabin was livable. The first week was spent clearing the site. I cut down a few trees, careful to select only what I needed, and stripped the bark to prepare the logs for the cabin walls. The work was exhausting but satisfying. By the end of each day, my arms ached and my clothes were soaked with sweat and sawdust. The woods around me were quiet but not silent. During the day, I'd hear birds chirping, the rustle of squirrels in the underbrush, and the occasional creak of trees swaying in the wind. At night, the sounds changed. Frogs croaked from a nearby creek, and coyotes howled in the distance. Sometimes I'd hear something larger moving through the forest, probably a deer, I told myself. But it always made my heart race. I wasn't scared exactly, but being out there alone, so far from anyone, made me hyper-aware of every noise. By the second week, I had the foundation laid and was starting to stack the logs for the walls. I worked from dawn until dusk, stopping only to eat and rest my sore muscles. The routine was comforting, but the isolation was starting to weigh on me. I caught myself talking out loud, narrating what I was doing, just to hear a voice. It felt silly, but it helped. One evening, as I was packing up my tools, I noticed something strange. A tree near the edge of the clearing had a fresh gash in the bark about 5 feet off the ground. It looked like someone had struck it with a hatchet, but the cut was jagged, as if done in a hurry. I hadn't been working in that area, and I hadn't seen anyone else on the property. I told myself it must have been an animal, a bear maybe, but the thought unsettled me. The next day, I found more marks. 3 trees, all within a few hundred yards of the cabin site, had similar gashes. They were too high up to be from deer and too deep to be from claws. I couldn't make sense of it. I kept working, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A few nights later, I woke up to a noise outside my tent. It was a soft rhythmic sound, like someone dragging a stick across the ground. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and peered out. The moon was bright enough to see the clearing, but nothing looked out of place. The sound had stopped. The next morning, I found a line of footprints in the dirt leading from the edge of the forest to the cabin site. They were large, barefoot, and definitely human. I stared at them for a long time, my mind racing. Whoever had made them had walked right past my tent, only a few feet away from where I'd been sleeping. I decided to take precautions. I started keeping my tools inside the tent at night in case I needed to defend myself. I also set up a crude alarm system using fishing line and empty cans, stringing it around the perimeter of my camp. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little safer. The next few days were uneventful. I focused on building, trying to keep my mind occupied. The cabin walls were nearly complete, and I was starting to work on the roof. But the feeling of being watched never left me. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping between the trees or a branch swaying when there was no wind. I'd stop what I was doing and scan the forest, but I never saw anything. One afternoon, I decided to take a break and explore the property. I followed the creek for a while, enjoying the sound of the water and the smell of wet earth. About half a mile from the cabin site, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop. It was a small clearing, and in the center was a pile of animal bones. They looked like they'd been there for a while, bleached white by the sun, but the arrangement was deliberate. They were stacked in a crude pyramid with a deer skull balanced on top. I backed away slowly, my skin crawling. It felt like a warning, though I couldn't say from what. I hurried back to the cabin site, my eyes scanning the forest the whole way. That night I barely slept. Every noise outside the tent made me jump. At one point, the cans I'd strung up clattered together, and I bolted upright, clutching a hammer. But when I looked outside, there was nothing there. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to finish the cabin as quickly as possible, then leave. I didn't care how much work I'd put into it or how much money I'd spent. Something wasn't right about this place, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. I worked like a man possessed, putting in 14-hour days to get the roof on and the door installed. By the end of the week, the cabin was done. It wasn't perfect. There were gaps between the logs, and the roof leaked in places, but it was enough. On my last night, I sat by the fire, staring at the cabin. It should have felt like an accomplishment, but all I felt was dread. The woods were too quiet, as if they were holding their breath. I packed my things and decided to sleep in the truck. I wanted to be ready to leave at first light. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something heavy hitting the side of the truck. I sat up, my heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight. The windows were fogged up from my breath, so I couldn't see outside. I waited, holding my breath, listening. The next sound was unmistakable, the slow, deliberate creak of the cabin door opening. I didn't wait to see who or what had gone inside. I started the truck and drove away, the tires spinning in the dirt. In my rearview mirror, I saw the cabin, its dark windows staring back at me like empty eyes. I never went back.